Pelican Valley is this really remote part of Yellowstone National Park out in Wyoming. When you look at pictures of it, you see these wide, meandering meadows, creeks cutting through the grass, and just this incredible 360-degree view of the mountains all around you. It honestly looks like the perfect place to set up a tent and just camp out under the stars. But it's not like the other parts of the park. To stay overnight in Pelican Valley, you have to get a special permit. And before the park rangers at Yellowstone will even consider giving you that permit, they sit you down and they make it very clear that Pelican Valley is a very dangerous place. They have a rule, or at least a very strong suggestion, that you should only go out there in groups of at least 4 people. It's just not a place you go alone. On the 28th of July 1984, a young woman named Brigida Fredenhagen arrived at Yellowstone. She was 25 years old, and she was there with her brother, Andreas, and her sister-in-law, Junko. The first night, they did what most visitors do. They stayed in one of the big established campgrounds called Grant Village. The next day, they were tourists. They went out to see one of the park's most famous hot springs, the Norris Geyser. That afternoon, after seeing the sights, they made a stop at the park ranger's office. This stop was for Brigida. Her plan was to spend the next night camping by herself in Pelican Valley. So she needed to apply for that special permit. When the 3 of them walked into the office, the rangers on duty initially thought they were all applying for a permit together. And since they were a group of 3, close enough to the recommended 4, the rangers weren't asking too many questions. They were just starting to go through the routine paperwork. But then Brigida spoke up and corrected them. She said, "No, it's just going to be me applying for a permit." And as soon as she said that, the whole vibe in the room changed. The rangers immediately stopped what they were doing and tried to talk her out of it. They told her, "This is a really bad idea. Nobody goes into Pelican Valley on their own." But Brigida was calm and assured them she was an experienced camper. She told them she understood the risks involved, she'd done her research, and she still wanted to go by herself. Her brother Andreas and his wife Junko, who were standing right behind her, they backed her up. They chimed in and told the rangers, "No, she's really good. She knows what she's doing." The park rangers were clearly not happy with this plan. You could tell they thought it was a huge mistake. But ultimately, they couldn't force her not to go. If she understood the risks and still wanted the permit, she was entitled to it. So they decided, you know what, if she wants to go, she can go. But they did take one final precaution. They asked her to show them on a map exactly where she intended to set up her camp. That way, if they needed to, they could come and check on her and make sure she was okay. So Brigida leaned over the map and pointed to a specific section. The rangers noted it down, handed her the permit, and that was that. She, along with Andreas and Junko, left the office and headed back to their campsite for the night. The next morning, the 3 of them got up early. They packed up their things, got in their car, and drove to the Pelican Valley trailhead. After they parked, they all got out and began walking into Pelican Valley together as a group. This was part of the plan. They walked for a few miles deep into the valley. Then, as they had arranged, the group stopped. Andreas told Brigida that this was as far as they were going. They were going to head back to the car now, and they would meet her right back here at the trailhead tomorrow. They said their goodbyes, and then Andreas and Junko turned around and started the long walk back to the car. Brigida watched them for a moment, then turned and carried on, deeper into the wilderness, all by herself. The following day, Andreas and Junko arrived at the trailhead at the agreed-upon time to meet Brigida. They waited. An hour went by. Then another. She didn't show up. After a couple of hours of waiting with no sign of her, they started to get very concerned. So they found a phone and called the park rangers. They asked them, "Have you seen Brigida?" The rangers said, "No, we haven't, but we'll go take a look for her." The area Brigida had pointed to on the map was inside a densely forested area, but it was right next to a large open meadow. This meant that as the park rangers approached her supposed campsite, they wouldn't actually be able to see it or her until they were practically right on top of it. So the rangers made their way across the big meadow and pushed into the edge of the forest. They started yelling out her name, Brigatita, but the only sound that came back was the wind in the trees. She didn't yell back. After a few minutes of searching and calling her name, they reached the exact area where she had said she was going to camp. And sure enough, there was her tent. But as they got closer, they could see it was a very odd scene. When they walked up to the tent, they immediately noticed a big vertical tear in one of the nylon walls. They cautiously poked their heads down to look inside. Everything was surprisingly neat. All of her belongings inside the tent were undisturbed. There was a foam sleeping mat laid out right in the middle. To the right of the mat was a flashlight that had been turned off. On the left side of the pad was a tape player with headphones. She must have been listening to it before she went to sleep. The play button was still down, but the batteries had run out. At the foot of the sleeping pad was her backpack. Inside of it, all of her clothes had been neatly packed inside of individual Ziploc bags. This is a common trick experienced campers use to mask their scent from animals. Also in the pack was a wilderness survival guide, and it was open to a specific page that was flipped down. The page showed a diagram of how to properly string your food up into the trees so that no animals can get to it. The rangers started looking around the outside of the tent. About 2 meters away from the back of the tent, they found her sleeping bag. It was laid out perfectly flat on the ground, almost like it had been put there to dry in the sun. But when they looked at it more closely, they found 2 small puncture marks in the fabric. One was up near the neck area of the bag, and the other was lower down near the torso. But there was no blood on the bag. Not a single drop. At this point, the rangers were starting to think this could have been some kind of animal attack, but they were really confused by how tidy and orderly the whole scene was. Typically, when a wild animal attacks a person or a campsite, it looks like a bomb went off. Tents are shredded, gear is scattered everywhere. It's a scene of total chaos. And this campsite was the complete opposite. It was very, very neat. As the rangers continued to walk around the campsite looking for any other clues and still yelling out for Brigatita, they found something else. A couple of meters away from where the sleeping bag was laying, they saw a faint trail in the dirt and pine needles. It was a barely discernible drag trail leading west from the camp into the forest and up a small hill. So the rangers started following this trail. They got about 20 meters away from the camp when they discovered Brigatita's cooler lying on the ground on its side. Whatever food had been inside of it was now gone. There was some string lying on the ground next to it, so it looked like she had followed the instructions in her book and strung the cooler up in the trees, but something had managed to get it down. From the cooler, the rangers continued walking along this faint drag trail. They went another 20 meters or so up the hill. That's when they found a woman's sweater on the ground. It had been torn up, and this time there was blood on it. At this point, the rangers knew this was bad. They unslung their rifles and held them at the ready. They kept walking, following the trail another 40 meters up and over the hill, and then down into a small clearing in the woods. And it was there that they found Brigatita, or what was left of her. No one knows for sure exactly what happened to Brigatita that night, but based on all the physical evidence they found, investigators were able to piece together a very clear and disturbing theory. After setting up her campsite, Brigatita had climbed inside of her tent. She got into her sleeping bag, and then she put her headphones on to listen to some music before falling asleep. Sometime later that night, a large male grizzly bear discovered Brigatita's cooler, which she had strung up in the trees about 20 meters away from her tent. And apparently, despite her best efforts, Brigatita just did not string it high enough. The bear was able to reach up, claw at it, and pull it down. After the bear ate all the food that was inside of the cooler, it was still hungry. So it began looking around the area for more to eat. It's believed that this particular bear was so accustomed to human traffic in this part of the park that when he stumbled across Brigatita's tent, he wasn't scared or cautious. In fact, he likely associated the tent with a source of food. So, this bear quietly lumbered over to the side of the tent. It reached up with one of its massive paws and cut a slice right through the nylon wall. Then, it put its head inside and bit down on Brigatita's skull and began dragging her and her sleeping bag out of the tent and away from the camp. There was no sign of a struggle either inside or near the tent. This indicates that Brigatita was most likely fast asleep when the attack began. Or maybe she just couldn't hear the bear approaching because she still had her headphones in, listening to her music. She was dragged 80 meters by her skull to that clearing, where she was consumed. An attack like this is exactly the reason why Pelican Valley is considered so dangerous. It's because the area is full of grizzly bears. And even though grizzly attacks on humans are incredibly rare, most people don't understand just how horrific they are when they do occur. Grizzly bears don't really try to kill their prey before they eat them. Instead, they focus on just pinning them down, getting them under their immense body weight so they can't go anywhere, at which point they can eat them at a leisurely pace. Some experts say grizzlies actually prefer to eat their prey while they're still living, which is why so often in grizzly attacks you see the arms and legs eaten first and then the head and torso. It's a method that keeps the victim alive just a little bit longer. Unfortunately, there was so little left of Brigatita that investigators couldn't pinpoint an exact time of death. However, because this bear broke normal grizzly behavior and intentionally targeted a human for food, there's a good chance he savored that meal. On the 28th of April 2000, a 24-year-old named Yuri Lipsky was standing in front of a cafe in Dahab, Egypt. He was looking out over the Red Sea. He had traveled all the way to the Sinai Peninsula from his home in Moscow for one very specific reason. He wanted to film himself swimming through an underwater feature called the Arch. But at that moment, it was looking like that probably wasn't going to happen. The Arch is an 85-foot-long underwater tunnel. It connects a massive sinkhole right on the shoreline called the Blue Hole to the open water of the Red Sea. To get to the Arch, you have to enter the Blue Hole directly from the shore and descend straight down 181 feet. At that depth, you'll reach the top of the tunnel on the northeast side of the sinkhole. But there's a catch. If on your descent you happen to miss the ceiling of this arch, which is apparently pretty easy to do in the deep, dark water, you run the risk of going too deep. Now, going too deep doesn't mean you're going to miss the tunnel altogether. The Arch is a huge opening. It starts at 181 feet, but its bottom goes all the way down to 393 feet. The real risk of going too deep has to do with how your body responds to the type of gas you're breathing under pressure. For those who aren't familiar with diving, there are generally two types of dives. There's recreational diving, where you breathe the same compressed air that you breathe on the surface. They literally just pump regular air into scuba tanks. With that, the recommended maximum depth you should ever go is 130 feet. Then there is technical diving. This is where you breathe a special mixture of gases, typically a mix of helium, nitrogen, and oxygen, that allows you to go safely below 130 feet. This type of diving is exponentially more dangerous and requires all sorts of additional training and specialized equipment. Because the minimum depth you need to reach just to get to the top of the arch is 181 feet, that puts the dive firmly in the technical diving range. This means you should absolutely be diving with a mixed gas and have special training and equipment. But year after year, people try to dive down to the arch and swim through it on regular air. And year after year, people die doing it. When your body absorbs too much nitrogen under pressure, you can get something called nitrogen narcosis. It's a lot like being drunk. Your judgment gets cloudy, you get confused. In extreme cases, divers who get this have been known to do irrational things, like remove their mouthpiece and try to breathe the water, believing they are actually on the surface. Below 130 feet, your body absorbs nitrogen much, much faster. And regular air is a whopping 78% nitrogen. So the risk of getting nitrogen narcosis is exponentially higher if you're breathing regular air at those depths. Also, oxygen itself can become toxic the deeper you go. It can lead to sudden blackouts and convulsions. If you don't have another diver there to literally physically pull you up into a shallower part of the water column, you won't recover from it and die. Regular air contains 21% oxygen, which is a lot of oxygen for a deep dive. So, if you're diving regular air below 130 feet, you are at a massively increased risk of developing oxygen toxicity. Now, to be clear, it is technically possible on regular air to dive down to 181 feet, make it through the arch, and come out the other side and be just fine. But you're realistically pushing the absolute boundary of what a human body can get away with on regular air. If you go below 200 feet, you're probably dead. So, if you're attempting to swim through the arch on regular air, you need to be paying extremely close attention to your depth gauge as you descend so that you don't miss the arch and accidentally drift down below 181 feet to the very deadly depths of 200 feet and beyond. So, earlier in the day, Yuri had gone down to the edge of the blue hole, and he had found one of the diving instructors that taught there. His name was TK Omar. Yuri asked him if he'd be willing to take him down to the arch to help him film himself going through it. TK said yes, he could, but he would need to train Yuri for 2 full weeks before he would be considered qualified to do that dive. And he would need a special equipment setup with a special gas mixture. Yuri was disappointed. He told TK, "Well, I'm leaving in 2 days to head back to Moscow, so I need to do this dive now. Is there any way you can do it today? Or tomorrow even?" And TK was firm. "No," he said, "that's not how this works." And TK understood this better than almost anyone else. Because in addition to teaching diving at the blue hole, TK's other job was to dive down to the bottom and retrieve the dead bodies of inexperienced or overconfident divers who attempted the archway and didn't make it. Although there is no official body count of how many people have died inside of the blue hole, locals believe it's as high as 200 people in just the last decade. After TK was unwilling to take him without properly training him and outfitting him with the right equipment, Yuri thanked him and went on to a couple of other diving instructors with the same request. "Will you take me in the next couple of days?" And they all said the same thing. "No, we need to train you and you need special equipment." And so finally, after no one was willing to bend the rules for him, Yuri just left. Later that day, the owners of the cafes that overlooked the blue hole remember seeing a young man who was by himself walk to the edge of the water. He put on all of his scuba gear. He put on a helmet and then strapped a big camera to the top of it, ratcheting it down tight. And then after he had all his gear on, he jumped into the blue hole and disappeared beneath the surface. That man was Yuri. A few days later, Yuri's family back home in Moscow realized he didn't get off the flight he was supposed to be on. They reported him missing. Word got back to Dahab, and TK Omar was contacted to go down into the blue hole and see if Yuri was down there. TK geared up, hopped in the blue hole, and descended to the bottom. And sure enough, lying face down on the sandy floor was Yuri. When they brought Yuri to the surface, they made a startling discovery. His camera had been running the whole time. He had actually filmed his own final moments. Yuri's final video exists online, so you can watch it for yourself, but here is a description of what happens. After situating the camera on his head just the way he wanted it, he hit the record button and then jumped into the water. It was later determined that Yuri was breathing regular compressed air out of his tanks. The camera submerges under the water, and you can see Yuri begin to sink very quickly into the darkness of the blue hole. But his breathing seems normal and he's not thrashing around, so it appears to be a controlled descent, at least at first. But at some point, you can hear Yuri trying to activate his buoyancy compensator. It's basically an inflatable life jacket that's part of your gear. You can add or release air into it to control your buoyancy, to hover, or in an emergency, you can fully inflate it to stop yourself from sinking and rise to the surface. But he's trying to use it to slow down his descent, and you can hear the air just escaping his compensator. There's a leak. He can't slow himself down. Now, Yuri was wearing a weight belt, which is very common in diving. And any certified diver knows that there is a quick release function on your weight belt. It's specifically for emergency situations like an uncontrolled descent. You can jettison your weight belt in one motion and you'll immediately start ascending to the surface. But Yuri was panicking. He was fixated on his buoyancy compensator that was failing. He was desperately trying to activate it, and so he completely forgot about his weight belt. And then he rockets past the entrance to the arch. He goes below 181 feet. He goes below 200 feet. And he goes all the way to the bottom, where he hits the floor at 392 feet. And then he begins to slide. The bottom of the blue hole is actually at an angle, and it slopes down towards the opening of the archway. If you slipped out of the blue hole at that depth, it was a sheer drop-off for thousands of feet into the abyss. And you can see on the camera, Yuri rolls over and he's desperately clawing into the mud and sand to stop himself from sliding out of the blue hole to certain death. He's trying to get himself to stop. And finally, he manages to anchor himself in the dirt. For a second, it's calm. He's kind of looking around. It's very clear he's confused, disoriented, and then everything goes still. It's believed that at this point, he either removed his mouthpiece because of the severe nitrogen narcosis, thinking he could breathe, or he was dealing with oxygen toxicity and he simply blacked out and the mouthpiece fell out of his mouth. But either way, he drowned. On the 25th of April 2003, a man named Aaron Ralston took a trip to Utah. His plan was to spend some time exploring the vast and rugged Canyonlands National Park. He slept in his truck that night, and the next morning at about 9:15 a.m., he got up. It was a beautiful Saturday morning. He hopped on his bike and he biked for 15 miles to get to the entrance of a place called Blue John Canyon. The canyon was an 11-mile-long gorge that at certain places was as narrow as 3 feet across. It was a classic slot canyon. So Aaron locked up his bike and began walking into this narrow canyon. About 6 hours later, at 2:45 in the afternoon, Aaron was at a section of the gorge that was getting really, really narrow. Below him, it was about a 100-foot drop down to the desert floor. He was planning to walk with 1 foot on each wall, kind of like Spider-Man, to get his way through this tight section of the canyon. But as he began that maneuver, a huge 800-pound boulder that was wedged above him became dislodged. It came tumbling down right towards him. He barely managed to get out of the way, but it landed directly on his right arm, pinning it against the canyon wall. He couldn't move. He was suspended 100 feet off the ground, and he was 20 miles away from the nearest paved road. Immediately, he tried to pull his hand free. He tried to push the rock off, but it wasn't going anywhere. It was solid. And that's when the horrifying reality of his situation dawned on him. He hadn't told anybody that he was going to be in this specific canyon today. Not a single person in the world knew where he was. He was so far away from anyone who could help him. And he didn't have a cell phone. He didn't have a satellite radio. He had no way to communicate with anyone who could potentially help him. Now, the position he was in wasn't him just dangling by his arm 100 feet off the ground. He was able to shift his body and position himself against the rock walls where he wasn't dangling. He was able to sit down fairly comfortably, besides the fact that his arm was being crushed. And he was even able to use the rock that had pinned him there as a sort of table or something to lean up against. After he calmed down a little bit, after a few minutes of pure panic, he reached back with his free arm and he pulled his backpack out in front of him. He started taking inventory of what he had. And it was not much. All he had was 12 ounces of water, which is just a single small water bottle. He had 2 burritos and a few candy bar crumbs at the bottom of a wrapper. That was all the food and water he had. In terms of tools, all he had was one of those crummy, cheap multi-tools. And it did have a little knife blade that extended off the end. Almost immediately, he took that multi-tool and he began chipping away at the massive boulder to try to see if he could maybe crack it, break off a piece, and push it off. But he found out very quickly that it was completely futile. The rock was not moving. It was an enormous boulder. It wasn't going anywhere. He could not possibly break it with this crappy little multi-tool. As the sun began to set on that first day, Aaron started thinking really seriously about trying to cut his arm off. But again, all he had was this multi-tool and its crappy little dull knife. And he was thinking, there's no way I can cut through my own arm. There's bone in there. I can't possibly saw through the bone with this thing. And so, very disheartened, he put his multi-tool away. He began to carefully nurse his tiny supply of water and slowly eat his food. He just thought, maybe some miracle will happen. Maybe over the next couple of days, someone will be hiking nearby within earshot. I can yell to them and they can come get me. Or maybe someone will see me from above when they're hiking on the rim of the canyon. I can just wait it out. But by the 5th day, he had run out of water completely. He was becoming delirious. He was actually drinking his own urine at this point just to stay alive. He fully expected that he was going to die overnight. And so, with his multi-tool, he began to etch his name into the rock wall next to him. And then underneath it, he etched the date he expected to die, which was the next day. After that, he put his multi-tool down. He did have a small camera with a limited amount of battery left. He pulled that out, and selfie style, he filmed goodbye messages to his family. He said his name was Aaron Ralston and that his parents were in Englewood, Colorado. He asked whoever might find the camera to please make an attempt to get it to them. After he was done filming, he put the camera away and he leaned up against the rock and he fully expected to die. But as he drifted off, he started to have this really intense, vivid dream. In the dream, he saw himself playing with a small child and he was missing his right arm. And he took this as a sign that he was supposed to chop his arm off, get out of there alive, and go start a family. And so he woke up from this dream, and suddenly, all he wanted to do was survive. He looked at his arm, which was already starting to decompose at this point, and he thought to himself, I know I can't cut through bone, but what if I'm able to break my arm, a clean break? Maybe then I can take this blade and cut through the break in the bone. And so, he began testing the idea. He used the sharp edge of the rock as a fulcrum to see if he'd be able to break his arm using the torque of pushing it over the edge. And when he started to sense that it was possible, he took a deep breath and then he broke his arm. He then took his multi-tool and over the next hour, he would painstakingly saw through his entire arm, the skin, the muscle, the tendons, the nerves. Once his arm was finally free, he couldn't believe it. He actually smiled when he looked back and saw his severed arm still pinned underneath the rock because of his sheer will to live at this point. And running high on adrenaline, he climbed the 65 feet out of this canyon with his one remaining arm. He got to the trail at the top and he ran for 6 miles until he happened to run into a group of hikers. They gave him food and water, and they were totally alarmed by his condition, but they were happy to help him. They called 911, and medics arrived and they saved Aaron's life. Following Aaron Ralston's incredible rescue, park rangers went back to the canyon to retrieve his arm. But in order to move that boulder, they had to bring out 13 park rangers, a hydraulic jack, a winch, and all this other heavy equipment. And even with all that, they were barely able to move it. And they later told Aaron, had you still been in place, there's no way we could have placed the equipment to move the rock without killing you in the process. So basically, he had to cut his arm off in order to get out of there. There was no other way out. And for Aaron, I'm sure that felt pretty good to hear, to know that he had made the absolute right, though brutal, decision. They took his arm, and they had it cremated, and they gave the ashes to Aaron. And Aaron, after having his cremated arm for a couple of days, decided, no, I need to put this where it belongs. And so Aaron went back out to the canyon where he had been trapped, and he scattered his own ashes over the boulder that had nearly killed him. In 2010, Aaron's ordeal was turned into a huge blockbuster movie called 127 Hours, where the actor James Franco plays Aaron Ralston. And it's an incredible movie, even though it's pretty hard to watch. Aaron Ralston himself has said that the movie, although it's a drama, is pretty much a documentary, because James Franco did an incredible job of portraying his emotions and what it was actually like to be trapped underneath that boulder for 5 days. On the evening of the 28th of October 2006, in a Florida city called Port Richey, a 37-year-old woman named Marika Weber walked in the front door of her home and called out a greeting to her mom. Her mom didn't call back, but Marika could hear her in the kitchen, moving around, making dinner. And so Marika walked over to say hello. But she only got about 2 feet into the family's very cramped and cluttered living room when one of their many cats came bombing into the room and nearly knocked Marika over as it ran past her. The cat ran up to the side of the wall and just stopped and stared intently at the baseboard like there was something there. Marika was totally annoyed by this cat. As she looked over at it, she knew exactly what it was doing. Lately, Marika had noticed that there were clearly rats in her family's home. She could hear them scurrying around in the ceilings and inside the walls all the time. And one of their cats was now clearly hunting one of these rats. This whole situation totally stressed Marika out. She'd actually recently begun taking anti-anxiety and antidepressant medication, largely because of this rat infestation and really just the fact that Marika hated living at her parents' home. But she didn't really have the financial means to go out and live in her own place, which she knew would solve the problem. And so she was just kind of stuck there. So Marika turned away from the cat and the rat that was likely behind the wall, and she made her way through the tight little living room into the kitchen. She gave her mom a quick hug, and she saw her dad was also in the room as well, and he said hello to her. Marika's mom offered her some food, but Marika said, "You know what? I'm not hungry. Thank you. I'm just tired. I'm gonna go to bed." And so Marika again gave her mom a hug, she said goodnight to her dad, and then she turned, walked up the stairs, and made her way to her bedroom. She went inside and shut the door. The next morning, Marika's parents got up and they began making breakfast and getting ready for the day. But Marika did not come downstairs. The parents just assumed she must have left early for her job. Marika was a secretary at a waste disposal company. And so the parents just had their breakfast and they too went out for their jobs. And then in the evening, when the parents were back home, Marika did not come home at the time she normally would after work. But the parents were not actually that concerned right then. They figured, okay, well, maybe she left early this morning, and so she came home from work early, and we just kind of missed her on both ends. And that's why the door to her bedroom is shut. She's just come home early, and she's in there, and she wants to be left alone. After all, she was a 37-year-old woman. She probably wanted her space. But later that night, when the parents still had not even heard their daughter moving around up there, the mother went upstairs and knocked on Marika's bedroom door. But there was no answer. And so finally, Marika's mom opened the door. The room was totally empty. Now, at this point, the parents did start to get concerned. They were thinking, okay, well, we didn't see her this morning, we haven't seen her now, we don't know where she is. But again, their daughter was 37 years old. And if she wanted to go do something out of the house by herself and not tell anyone, she was kind of entitled to do that. And so the parents ultimately decided that they would just let this go for now and that in the morning they were sure they would see her. But the next morning, the parents still had not heard from Marika. She had not come home. And now they were officially starting to panic. In particular, the mother was worried that Marika might have been kidnapped or something, maybe going to or coming back from work. Because Marika was only 5'3" tall and maybe 100 pounds. She was really small. So Marika's mom called her other daughter, Gina, in a total panic, saying, "You know, your sister, she's missing. We don't know where she is. She might have gotten kidnapped. Come over and help us figure out what's going on." So Gina came over to the house. And when she came inside, she told her parents, let's just stay calm here. Marika is 37. I'm sure she's fine. Let's search the house and see if there's a note or something from Marika explaining where she is and what she's doing. So the family searched the whole house, starting with Marika's room. But they couldn't find anything that gave them any clues about what had happened to Marika. But they did eventually find Marika's purse, and it was still in her room. And when they opened it up, they saw her wallet was still inside. And so that sent up a huge red flag for the family. They were thinking, why would Marika go anywhere for an extended period of time without her wallet? That made no sense. And so at this point, the family did call the police, and they reported Marika missing. But the police got nowhere on the case. And so on November 9th, 12 days after Marika had said goodnight to her parents, gone up to her room, and then vanished, the family was at a total loss for what to do. But Gina, Marika's sister, had begun to think to herself, hey, it's possible that Marika, who was not doing well mentally, she was very unhappy, she was totally stressed out about this rat infestation, which really just highlighted the fact that she was stuck at home with her parents at 37 years old. Gina was thinking that it was totally possible that Marika had just abruptly run away. Or worse, maybe she had harmed herself. So on November 9th, Gina decided she would take one more pass through the family home and just see if she could find any little indication that would give away what was going through Marika's mind before she vanished. And where Gina started was in Marika's room. So Gina went upstairs, down the hall, she opened up her sister's bedroom door, and she walked inside. And you have to picture this space. It was totally cluttered, almost like a hoarder's space. There were piles of clothes that were taller than a person. I mean, this room was totally packed with stuff. But Gina took her time kind of walking through the room, looking everywhere, sifting through all the piles of junk and clothes and everything else in the room, and she couldn't find anything. But then at some point, her attention was drawn to her sister's bookshelf. And she looked over at it, and she thought she saw something odd, right in the middle of the shelf, down low. Now, Gina had a flashlight with her, and even though the light was on in the room, she still lifted up the flashlight and turned it on and shined it at this thing in the middle of the bookcase. And when she saw what it was, she screamed. Based on Gina's discovery, here is what happened to Marika Weber on the 28th of October 2006, the night she disappeared. That night, Marika had come home. She saw her mom and dad in the kitchen. She was offered food. She turned it down and said, "I'm tired. I'm going to bed." She went upstairs. She went into her room, closed the door, and sat down on her bed. Then Marika grabbed a pill bottle that was next to her bed, which contained morphine and codeine, two very powerful painkillers. She popped a few of those, and then she rolled a marijuana joint and smoked that. And then she grabbed the TV remote and sat back on her bed, getting ready to zone out. But when she tried to turn on the TV, which was sitting on this bureau on the other side of the room, it didn't turn on. And right away, Marika knew that the TV had likely become unplugged. This was something that happened periodically. The room was so packed with stuff that sometimes when Marika was just navigating through her room, the stuff would bump into the bureau, and that would in turn jostle the plug loose from the wall socket. But the TV was actually not plugged in right behind where this bureau was. The TV was sitting on the bureau, but the plug ran down and kind of to the side of the bureau behind this huge bookshelf that was pressed right up against it. But this bookshelf was so loaded down with books and things that Marika had collected over the years that not only could you not really reach through the bookcase to the wall, but it was too heavy. You couldn't move the bookcase. And so the only way to access this plug from the TV was to climb on top of the bureau where the TV was and kind of reach back and down and grab the plug behind the bookcase and plug it back in. And so Marika, who was likely beginning to feel the effects of all the drugs she had taken, climbed on top of this bureau. And she reached back behind this 6-foot-tall bookcase, and she began trying to grab the plug, but it was just out of her reach. And so she leaned farther and farther and farther until she finally grabbed the plug. But just as she managed to plug it back into the wall, she slipped forward and fell headfirst into this tiny, narrow space between the back of the bookshelf and the wall. And she got pinned there, upside down. Now, we don't know why Marika didn't begin calling out for help immediately. Perhaps she was so under the influence of the drugs that she couldn't really process the situation and didn't know what she should do. Or maybe she was just embarrassed about the fact that she had somehow gotten herself trapped upside down behind her own bookcase. But either way, she didn't call out for help right away. And unfortunately, what happens when a human body is trapped upside down for long enough is all the blood rushes to the upper part of your body. The pressure builds, it causes your eyes eventually to pop out of your head. It feels like your head is going to explode. But the real problem is, all that blood pools around your lungs and restricts them, and it makes it really, really hard to breathe. And critically, if you can't take a big breath in, you can't project your voice loud enough to call out for help. And so, Marika did not call out for help during those first critical few moments she was trapped behind the bookcase. And then, when she realized she absolutely couldn't move, she no longer had the lung capacity to call out for help. And so, likely for 1 or maybe even 2 days, Marika remained trapped upside down behind this bookshelf. She was likely aware of her family coming in and out of her bedroom looking for her, but she was not able to vocalize. She could not get their attention. And so eventually, she died. Marika's family would later say that when they were looking for Marika in her bedroom while she was dying behind the bookcase, they did hear sounds. But they said the sounds were just like the rats that were running all over their house. And so they didn't know it was actually likely Marika moving around behind the bookcase, trying desperately to get their attention because she couldn't use her voice. And then after Marika died, her family did continue to go back into her room to look for her, and they began to smell something funny, which was Marika decomposing. But the family didn't know that, and they chalked it up to the fact that the room was really messy, and again, there were rats in the house. This was not a clean space. And so they just thought, okay, the smell can't be anything serious. It wasn't until November 9th when Marika's sister Gina was back in Marika's bedroom, and she looked over at the bookcase, and she saw something strange. What she saw was her sister's foot sticking out from behind the bookcase. Gina couldn't really process it at first, so she got her flashlight out, she shined it on the foot, and when she scanned from the foot down into the darkness, she realized it was her sister. On the morning of the 25th of June 2007, a 28-year-old man named Mike Barnett woke up to the sound of pounding rain on the roof of his home, which was located in Hull, a city in northern England. Mike groaned as he rolled out of bed. It had been raining like this for the past month, and he and the rest of the people in Hull were just totally over it. But another reason he groaned is he knew that he would have to go to his job at a tropical fish store, even though he was not scheduled to work that day. There was a street right behind the tropical fish store that always, without fail, completely flooded out whenever it rained hard. All this debris would get washed down the street and clog up the drain. And the owner of the tropical fish store, Mike's boss, who was an elderly guy, he would always go out and try to clear the debris himself. And Mike just knew that his boss really needed help with it. And today, with this storm, he knew his boss would be out there. And so he just felt like it was his responsibility to go in and help him clear out the debris. So Mike got dressed, he had some breakfast, and then as quietly as he could, he slipped out the front door. Mike was careful not to make too much noise because he didn't want to wake his dad, who he lived with. Mike and his dad had always been very close, but after the recent death of Mike's mother, he and his father had become even closer. They actually really enjoyed living together. But Mike also knew that his dad was very protective of him and would very likely not like the idea of Mike going out in this horrible storm to go try to clear debris in a flooded-out street. It just sounded too dangerous. And Mike just didn't want to have that argument right now. And so he was able to slip out without waking up his dad. Mike hopped in his car and he drove to the fish store. And as soon as he got there, he hopped out. He went around to the back side of the shop, and sure enough, the entire street out back was totally flooded. Clearly, debris had blocked the drainage system again. Now, Mike's boss was not out there yet. Mike could see him inside the shop, kind of going about his morning routine. And so Mike, without even going inside to say hello, just began wading into the water to start clearing the debris. The drain that was clogged by all this debris was located just off to the side of the sidewalk. It was down in a culvert. And so Mike very carefully walked off that sidewalk into this very cold, muddy water, and he began moving in the direction of where he knew the drain was. And so as he's walking, the water is down to his ankles, then it's up to his knees. But he gets closer and closer to where he knows this drainage grate is, down in this culvert. And suddenly, Mike began feeling this unbelievable suction at his feet that began pulling him basically straight down. Mike tried to move, but his feet felt like they were anchored to the ground. And then before he knew what was happening, he began getting pulled forward towards the drain, and then down he went. And as he went all the way down up to his neck in the water, he felt this unbelievable searing pain in his thigh. Mike didn't know it, but his leg had been sucked through the drainage grate that was all blocked up. There were still some small holes in it. And so his leg had gone through one of those holes, and the force of the water had pulled him all the way up to the top of his thigh and brutally snapped his leg in the process. And so Mike is in blinding pain from his leg being shattered and run through this grate. And he's literally up to his neck in this frigid water. And the wind's blowing and it's raining and the dirty water is splashing in his mouth. And so Mike begins to panic and he's trying to pull himself out, but he can't. And then he begins screaming for help. At that moment, the owner of the fish store, who was still inside, looked out the window and he saw Mike flailing around in the water. And instinctively, the owner could tell just from the panicked look on Mike's face that whatever was happening to him was a serious emergency. And so the owner just picked up the phone and called the police. And after telling them what was happening, the owner ran out to Mike. When the first police officers arrived on the scene, Mike was still in the water up to his neck, and the shop owner was right there next to him trying to help. And the police officers, they assessed the situation in front of them, and they thought, okay, clearly this guy Mike is trapped in the water. This is serious, but we can probably just pull him out. That's the obvious solution here. And so the two officers walked up to Mike. They waded through the water and got on either side of him, kind of pushing the shop owner out of the way. And then the two officers grabbed Mike's shoulders. These are strong police officers. And they began pulling on Mike with all their strength. And as soon as they did, Mike let out this unbelievably loud scream of just pure agony. In fact, his scream was so guttural and full of pain that the two officers instinctively let go, kind of startled by it. And very quickly, these officers realized this situation was far worse than it appeared. Because not only was this guy totally stuck and he couldn't be moved, but, they're looking around and the rain is still coming down hard and it's clear the water is still slowly rising. And because Mike's own body was now situated over the grate, he himself was causing even more of a blockage, which was increasing how fast the street was flooding. This meant the officers knew they had to get Mike out as soon as possible or he was going to drown. But over the next several hours, more police officers, firefighters, EMTs, even Good Samaritans, everybody showed up on the scene. And there were so many attempts to get Mike out of the water. They ranged from trying to cut the grate, but the water was too muddy, so nobody could see through it to get a good position. And the force of the water was so strong that nobody could get the bolt cutters to clamp onto the actual grate. And then at one point, they even tied a winch around Mike and tried to pull him out with a Land Rover, but every single intervention failed. The rushing water that was pinning Mike to this grate was so strong, and Mike's pain in his shattered leg was so high, it made it nearly impossible to move him at all. And so finally, at the 4-hour mark that Mike had been trapped in this water, a decision was made amongst all the first responders. They were going to have to amputate his leg. So the police called a doctor who was willing to come to the scene and perform the leg amputation right there in the floodwater. And as all this was being arranged, Mike could sense something was up. He could tell it was not going well. And he began frantically asking the police and all the first responders, "When are you going to get me out of here? When are you going to get me out of here?" And they just kept telling him, "Soon, soon, Mike. Just hold on. It's going to be okay." Meanwhile, the owner of the shop at this point had called Mike's dad to tell him what was going on. And so as all these people were waiting for this doctor to show up to cut Mike's leg off, Mike's father arrived at the scene. He basically barreled through the crowd and started screaming, "I'll get my son out of here." But as soon as he saw his son, he was totally taken aback. Mike was up to his chin in water. There was a diver in the water behind him now, holding him up, just barely keeping his head above the rising flood. Mike's face was totally pale, and his eyes were completely unfocused. And he had this weird blank expression, like he wasn't even there anymore. And then a second later, a whole wall of police came running up to Mike's dad to stop him from getting any closer. And they told Mike's father that they were doing everything they could to try to get his son out. And for now, they told him, he just needed to go home. And so even though Mike's dad did not want to abandon his son, he could tell with all these police standing there in front of him, there was no way he was going to be able to get to his son. And so he turned around and headed back home without even getting to speak to Mike. And then when Mike's dad got home, he turned on the news. And the news was showing live coverage of his son trapped in that grate. And just a couple of minutes later, Mike's dad would watch his own son die live on the news. By the time that doctor arrived with the special saw to cut off Mike's leg, it was already too late. Mike had passed away from hypothermia. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. Tonight, I have two great stories, but I couldn't figure out how to tease them like I do at the top of these episodes. I realized that what makes these stories special is that they're both great campfire stories. Two teenage girls named Rachel and Molly lived in a quiet, rural New York in the late 1990s. Best friends, they were inseparable and part of a large high school group that spent a lot of time together. Still, Rachel and Molly had a special bond within that larger circle. Two of them were often seen together, sharing secrets and navigating high school. Love of goth culture brought them together and bonded their group. High school goths had a distinct identity in the late 1990s and early 2000s. It meant wearing mostly black. Black nail polish, lipstick, and a deep black hair coloring. Celebrate all things dark and macabre. Others saw it as a philosophical exploration of life's darker side and a way to express their non-mainstream feelings. Many saw it as a fashion statement, a way to stand out and feel special. It was a distinct subculture in the late 1990s, and Rachel and Molly were fully committed to it. They liked the music, fashion, and atmosphere. A favorite hangout for Rachel, Molly, and their goth friends was the local cemetery. It was initially a joke, an ironic performance of their identity. Where else would the goth kids hang out than a cemetery? Their first few trips there were humorous because it felt too predictable. Odd thing happened. The cemetery was actually cool to hang out in. They were never bothered there in the peace. So it became their seat. It was their weekend hangout. The cemetery was usually visited at night by Rachel, Molly, and their friends. This maximized the dark, spooky atmosphere they were going for, leaning goth. A more important rule was that they always went together. Rachel and Molly were never alone. They always hung out with several of their friends. This had several causes. First, more people meant more energy and conversation, making it more fun. Though they loved it, the cemetery was creepy at night. Numbers provided safety. It felt less intimidating and more like their own park with a group. Rachel was home alone on a Friday night, bored, when the phone rang. Was Molly. Caller Molly was cheerful. Rachel replied immediately when she asked, "Hey, you want to go hang out in the cemetery?" "Duh," she said. They did it on weekends. "I'd love to go." "Come pick me up." Rachel got ready after saying goodbye. It was her usual all-black outfit, makeup, and waiting outside for Molly's car. A few minutes later, Molly's headlights turned onto her street, and the car pulled up to the curb. Rachel saw Molly alone in the car first. It was odd. When they picked her up for cemetery nights, the car was usually full of friends. Rachel entered through the passenger door. While buckling her seatbelt, she asked Molly, "Hey, so where is everyone? Are we going to pick up the rest of the group now?" Molly dismissed her. "In fact, no," she said. "I tried calling everyone else, but they're all busy. Some are working, some are hungover from last night. It's just going to be us two at the cemetery. Is that okay?" Rachel had an uneasy feeling. Really, this was wrong. They did not do this. The cemetery hangout was about group dynamics and shared experience. Just one person made me feel more vulnerable. There was no problem with her closeness to Molly. Being in that big, dark cemetery without their friends made them uncomfortable. She looked over at Molly, who seemed to have accepted it. Rachel didn't want to be negative or crude. It seemed impossible to say no now. So she smiled and said, "Oh yeah, that's fine. It'll be great, just the two of us. Let's go." Despite her hesitation, she sat down and they drove the half-mile to the cemetery. The cemetery was massive. A massive, ancient burial ground stretched for miles. A massive, medieval-looking gate with a wrought iron archway spanned the entrance, greeted you as you approached. The archway made the gates look Gothic and imposing, even though they were always open. After passing that arch, a single road ran straight down the cemetery from front to back, probably over a mile. That road divided the grounds into two huge parts, the right and left. Molly, Rachel, and their friends frequented the back left corner. Terrain was their reason for choosing that area. Left of the cemetery were rolling hills where plots were laid out. That back left corner had a natural depression, a shallow bowl with few tombstones. At the bottom of this depression was a large boulder and tree. This place fit them. Standing at the main gate and scanning the vast cemetery, anyone sitting in that depressed area would be hidden. Teenagers wanted to be hidden, so they were. It was their secret hideout. So Rachel and Molly drove through the grand gate and down that long straight road to the cemetery's back. The sun had set and it was growing dark. Although it wasn't pitch black, the light was fading fast. Nobody was around, as usual. This time of night, the cemetery was usually empty. Local university students occasionally hopped the fence on the opposite side of the cemetery from them. They sometimes lit a bonfire against the fence on that side. Sometimes they sneaked over and did it, even though it was illegal. But that was unusual. Most of the cemetery was empty except for college students. They parked at the end of the road and exited. They descended the gentle grassy slope from the road into their usual gathering spot, the depression. At the bottom, they leaned back against the tree trunk on the big rock by their usual spots. They smoked cigarettes and talked as usual. Rural New York goth teens in the 1990s did this. They chatted about boyfriends, school drama, and stories. Light faded from the sky, making it completely dark. Girls still enjoyed themselves. Rachel was thinking this was kind of nice. Not as scary as she expected. It was calm and comfortable, and she was spending time with her best friend. They noticed a new smell after a while. Smoke smelled distinct. The bonfire spot across the cemetery was now remembered by both. Even though it was far away, college students could have started a fire. First, they glanced over that way and saw nothing, but they'd been hanging out for a while. While they were down there, those kids could have hopped the fence and started a fire. They weren't bothered by the fire. On the other side of the huge cemetery, it didn't affect their work. Rachel and Molly knew from past experience that the police always arrived at bonfires there. Predestined. They were kicked out after the police made the kids put out their fire. To ensure no one was around after hours, they always swept the cemetery. Even if they weren't starting fires, Molly and Rachel would be expelled. Rachel and Molly looked at each other as they smelled the smoke and agreed. Leave now before the police arrive and force them to. Additionally, they had been there for a while and were ready to leave. Their timeline accelerated slightly. It was fine. They extinguished their cigarettes, gathered their belongings, and walked back up the hill to the car. As they climbed the hill, they expected to see their car parked on the road. They hoped to see the tiny flicker of the bonfire they were smelling across the cemetery. They didn't see a fire on the cemetery's other side when they reached the hilltop. Instead, to their right, maybe 100 meters away, was another depression and rolling hill that dipped out of sight. They saw flickering flames from that direction. The fire started in the depression next to their cemetery, not across it. This was odd. This side of the cemetery was empty when they arrived. The place was empty. Someone had arrived while they were there and started a fire nearby. Never before had they seen this. It was strange. Nobody started fires here. What happened? Both girls wondered. They assumed the college students had tried a new place. They only saw the fire's tops rising from the ridgeline, not the people. The person over there probably didn't know they were here. They had an idea. Molly asked Rachel, "What if we go back down and sneak up the other side of our hill? We could poke our heads over and see who it is. We could spy on them." An exciting, slightly mischievous idea. Why not since they were here? Two girls agreed, turned around, and returned to depression. They climbed the hill opposite the mysterious fire, past the big rock and tree where they had been sitting for 2 hours. They moved quietly to hide. Rachel accidentally made noise as they approached the hilltop, where they could see the fire and whoever was there. In the quiet night, she stepped on a dry branch or loose rock, which cracked loudly. Fire crackling was the only sound. No one spoke from the other side. Rachel covered her mouth and stared at Molly. Molly asked, "What are you doing?" "We're trying to be quiet." Twin girls froze. They stood still, listening to see if the firemen heard them. It was silent. A spooky silence. The mood changed then. Something was off. Even though they hadn't reached the top of the hill or seen who was at the fire, their playful curiosity had turned into a cold dread. Both looked at each other and knew they were thinking the same thing. They agreed, maybe we should just turn around and leave. Yeah, let's get out of here. This doesn't feel right. As quietly as possible, the two girls turned around and returned to their depression. They quickly passed the rock and tree and returned up the hill to their car. Rachel glanced back over her shoulder at the hill they had just come from while walking. And what she saw chilled her. Man stood on ridgeline. The fire behind him silhouetted him, making him ominous against the orange glow. Standing still, he stared at them. Though silent, he watched them. It was him at the fire. The Rachel noise must have reached him. Molly turned and saw the man as Rachel frantically whispered, "Molly, look, look." She felt pure fear. "Let's get out of here," she panicked. "We don't know who that guy is." "We have to go now." They stopped, ran up the hill. Seconds later, Rachel glanced back. The hillman was gone. She thought he was gone, terrified. Then she saw movement in the darkness below. He ran down the hill toward them. Girl screamed. The grassy slope to the road was scrambled at full speed. The man was closing in, and Rachel kept looking back. He moved quickly. They ran to Molly's car after climbing the hill, their lungs burning. They fiddled with the doors, jumped inside, and slammed them shut, locking them. Molly started the engine, jumped out, and screeched tires on the asphalt. Rachel watched out the back window as they drove down the cemetery road. She saw him. Reaching the road, he was almost there. He paused as their car vanished into the night. After turning, he slowly descended the hill out of sight. Molly and Rachel were traumatized. Their hearts raced and they panted. That was no college student. That was a grown man, possibly in his 40s, unfamiliar to them. Everything felt creepy and dangerous. It baffled them. They kept asking, what would have happened if he caught us? What was he trying to do? What just happened? By the time Molly dropped Rachel off at her house, the terror had subsided and been replaced by cautious energy. They nearly laughed it off as a crazy night. Man, that was insane, huh? They told a wild story about a close call. They promised not to return alone at night. Rachel entered home. Never told her mom what happened. She put her things down, went to her room, and calmed down. Without telling anyone about their terrifying encounter, Molly did the same at home. They both went to bed to forget. The next morning, Rachel went downstairs to the kitchen. Mom was making coffee and going through her morning routine. She asked, "Hey, how was your night last night?" Rachel shrugged. "Oh, it was fine. Me and Molly went out." "No big deal." Her mother looked serious. Ripped her head. "Oh, did you hear what happened last night?" Her mother asked gravely. "No, what do you mean?" "What happened?" "Well, A woman in our town got kidnapped. She was taken from the parking garage where I park for work. She worked in the same building as me. Rachel's wide eyes. The mother of Rachel breathed deeply. No. I mean, yes, they found her. But unfortunately, it was too late. When they found her, she was dead. And whoever kidnapped and killed her, they brought her body to the local cemetery last night. And they burned her in a huge bonfire. Her mom let the words sink in. Whoever did it still hasn't been caught. Hearing this felt like the floor fell out from under Rachel. Her world fell apart. Now, everything from the night before made sense sickeningly. They smelled no college party bonfire. Mom mentioned that fire. A man chased them and was the killer. The murdered woman's body was likely in that fire. They were just 100 meters from a killer dumping his victim's body. Scary thought. They likely witnessed the killer set the fire and start this horrific act. What if that man caught them? Were they to continue spying on him over the hill without Rachel's noise, what would he have done to them? Rachel broke down and told her mom everything from the night before. Horror struck her mother. Rachel called Molly immediately to tell her what she had learned. Caller Molly went hysterical. They realized how close they were to disaster. They presented their case to the police. They best described the man, but it wasn't much. They feared the dark. All they knew was that he was average-sized and probably in his 40s. It wasn't specific. Fortunately, police caught the killer 48 hours later. Not because of the girl's description, but luck. Police saw the victim's car driving around town. Car stopped, and the driver was the killer. After arrest, he confessed. Not surprisingly, Rachel and Molly never saw that cemetery the same. They feel lucky when they think about that night. Rachel's accidental noise as they approached the fire may have saved them. One accidental sound made them pause, reconsider, and turn around to leave. That saved them because if they had crested that hill and met the killer, they may have both died in that bonfire. I served in the military before starting this channel and telling strange, dark, and mysterious stories online. 7 years as Navy SEAL. I thought that was my life's purpose and career. Getting hurt made it not the right fit for me in the long run. The rest is history after I left the service. My military experience includes many funny stories about our brutal training and some scary stories about my overseas service. Experiencing my first deployment to Afghanistan has always stood out to me as a special memory. That it's not a war story helps it stand out. The Navy SEAL training took almost 3 years of my life. An arduous process. I finally arrived. SEAL Team 2 in Virginia was my East Coast assignment. We immediately started training for our first deployment and learned we were going to Afghanistan. This was in 2013, when going to Afghanistan meant fighting. There were active combat operations nationwide. Navy SEALs and other direct combat units want war. You've spent years training for it, not because you're a warmonger or love violence. You want to prove yourself and do your best after all your hard work. Thus, I was preparing for battle. It was deployment day. In a typical SEALs flight, the team isn't sent out together. It's unsafe. That plane crash could kill a platoon. You're sent out in small batches, sometimes on civilian flights for the first leg. I flew to South America with 2 other SEALs dressed as civilians. From there, we took a military transit flight into Afghanistan. I was focused throughout. The end. I've prepared for this. Here goes. The last leg of the trip, the flight into Afghanistan, was on that military plane. The military pilots made 2 changes when we entered active war zone Afghan airspace. A dark red replaced the aircraft's white overhead lights. They then told us to avoid windows over the intercom. We were approaching the most dangerous part of the flight, landing. You didn't want to sit next to a window if the plane was shot at from the ground. It wouldn't matter where you were sitting if the plane was hit by a rocket-propelled grenade, but it was a stark reminder that we were about to enter a war zone. Also intense was landing these large transport planes in combat zones. They needed to minimize ground-level small arms fire at them. Lower people are more vulnerable. They would land combatively. They would dive straight down toward the runway and pull up at the last second to land abruptly. It was rough. We were on this crazy landing, red lights glowing, everyone tucked away from the windows, and my mind kept repeating, "Okay, we're ready for Afghanistan." Fob Shank is a well-fortified base where we landed safely. The massive ramp at the back of the plane lowered after taxiing. Since my gear had been shipped on pallets weeks earlier, I grabbed my pack. I had only my backpack. I and a teammate walked down the ramp onto the tarmac. We existed. First sighting of Afghanistan. I didn't see the country the first time because the plane windows were tiny portholes and we were told to avoid them. Honestly, standing there and looking around was breathtaking. Afghanistan's beauty is astounding. These massive snow-covered mountains and beautiful wide-open fields surrounded us 360 degrees. The land appeared unspoiled. The jagged scar on the earth was the NATO base, where war was launched. Contrast was striking. I didn't understand. This place was too beautiful to fight. That feeling did not last. We were quickly led to a holding area, grabbed our gear, and loaded into MRAPs or heavily armored military vehicles. These are IED-resistant 50-ton beasts. We drove from that big base to a smaller, more remote, forward-operating base in the sticks. It was more vulnerable, and we would operate there for 6 months. Our new home arrived late that night. This primitive outpost was in the middle of nowhere. When we arrived, the SEAL team we were replacing was finishing their deployment. There were interpreters who are crucial to the war effort. These interpreters were mostly 20-somethings who had worked on these bases with American units for years. They couldn't leave the base because they worked with NATO. As traitors, the Taliban and other militant groups targeted them. These interpreters believed that working with NATO would allow them to leave Afghanistan and immigrate to the US. Some fulfilled that promise. And these guys were tough. They fought more than most soldiers. They witnessed some incredible events. I met our partner force and interpreters right away because my platoon role involved working closely with them. SEAL Team 8, already there, was crazy. There had been 6 months of fighting. These huge men with massive beards seemed unconcerned about everything. My first night, I was super green. I met with one of our interpreters to learn the scope and expectations. We discussed possible operations and got to know each other. This 25 or 26-year-old interpreter leaned in and said, "Bro, bro," and they all used American slang they picked up from being around young soldiers and Marines all day. He asked, "Bro, have you heard the story of what was in the cave in Kandahar? We were in a different province." I soon learned that local interpreters and soldiers had a persistent, almost legendary story about a giant, big humanoid creature that lived in a cave in Kandahar's mountains. Afghanistan has endless mountains and caves. Humans have probably never explored many of these caves in remote areas. Indeed, this interpreter was serious. He declared, "Bro, I'm telling you, it's real. There was a giant up in the caves in Kandahar. Have you heard about this?" He seemed curious and wanted to know more. It planted a seed in my mind without further discussion that night. This interpreter, who had seen real combat and was not prone to fantasy, believed this weird story. The idea stuck. Many years later, I'm out of the military and writing strange, dark, and mysterious stories online. At the start of the channel, I was thinking about what stories to tell, and remembered the Kandahar giant. It seemed like a good idea to investigate what my interpreter was saying. I found this treasure trove of testimony from a specific group of Green Berets, a special forces team that had a very real and very strange encounter in Kandahar caves. one soldier, anonymously known as Mr. K, due to fear of repercussions for speaking out, gave shocking testimony about what they saw. I wanted to compile all the notes and tell my interpreter's story from years ago. I'll repeat that story tonight. An Army infantry unit patrolled Kandahar in 2002. Imagine huge, snow-covered peaks and deep valleys. In 2002, these patrols searched for Taliban hideouts and cave systems or enemy fighters in valleys below. These patrols were routine. Soldiers, regardless of branch, update their superiors while on patrol. Routine or not, most operations are planned. Everything is planned: when you arrive, how long you'll stay, your goals, when you leave, and how you'll leave. It's organized. This infantry unit patrolled routinely. However, their higher command lost contact with them mid-mission. A red flag was raised immediately. A unit's communications were sometimes lost. It's hard to send radio signals across huge mountain ranges with imperfect equipment. Usually, lost communications are recovered quickly. A long time passed without this unit's response. As the higher command debated whether to send a quick reaction force or air assets to find them, something even more alarming was noted. The unit went silent without calling a tick first. A tick troops in contact indicates a gunfight. This step is crucial. If you're shot, your command doesn't know. Call it in. A support system activates when you do. Air support, medical evacuation, and reinforcements may be needed. Someone on the ground yells tick, tick, tick into the radio when a firefight begins. Everyone is on alert to help. Soldiers call in ticks too quickly because they're like cheat codes for overwhelming support. An engagement of this magnitude rarely goes unreported. To have an entire unit go silent without calling in a tick was strange. It meant it was either a massive, unprecedented radio failure or something else that didn't fit combat patterns. After a while, the Army decided to send an elite unit to find the unit. The mission was given to the Army's top special forces, the Green Berets. Mr. K was in that Green Beret detachment. Mr. K's small team of Green Berets took helicopters to the remote Kandahar area where the infantry unit was last seen. The landing was as rural as it gets. Only the occasional mud hut existed. That mountain range was vast and empty. It can feel like another planet. There was nothing to see. All around was a wasteland, no locals or Americans. People knew the search area was huge and the terrain was rough. Hiking through the mountains to find the missing soldiers would be difficult for several days. Each carried a heavy pack of ammo, water, and gear. They hiked the missing unit's rough route. Hiking through the mountains yielded nothing. For several days, they hiked all day. They had a few distant enemy encounters, but nothing major. They were searching for missing soldiers, not fighting. Hiking, they searched the landscape for clues. Days went by with no results. On their fourth day of searching, Mr. K and his team saw a goat trail ahead while walking through a mountain range. The narrow path climbed and crossed the mountain. So they took it. No intelligence led them there, but it was a trail which was easier to walk on than the rocky terrain they had been navigating. They thought they'd follow it across, get a better view, and spot something in the next valley. Therefore, Mr. K and the Green Berets started up the winding goat trail. As they walked, they saw plastic and metal fragments on the path. They were initially unidentified. While climbing, they realized these were military equipment fragments. Radios and other equipment from an American infantry unit were included. Their senses were primed. The men had rifles ready, including Mr. K. They climbed the trail more cautiously, knowing they were on the right track, but that they could face danger. On top of this mountain, what would they find? Bloody ambush grounds? Surviving unit members? Unaware. Evidence increased as they hiked. Large radios and military backpacks were found. They found uniforms with name tags and unit patches. They now knew the uniforms belonged to the unit they were looking for. They had found their first real lead, and it looked bad. They reached Trail's Peak. Green Berets are the world's best trained soldiers. Regardless of how bizarre, their training would take over. They would have moved precisely and confidently, ready for anything. After climbing the trail, Mr. K and his team reached a flat plateau. 3 massive cave entrances opened up onto the plateau like front porch doors as the mountain rose above it. More military equipment was scattered on this plateau, but this time it was different. Some bones were human. Human bones were scattered. No one was here. If the missing unit were here, something terrible had happened to them. Green Berets set up defensive positions around the plateau immediately. It was imperative to clear those caves. Inside were survivors? The perpetrators were inside? To investigate, Mr. K and his shooting partner had to approach a cave entrance. The team supplied cover and watched all angles as they crossed the plateau silently. Mr. K entered with his partner. A huge opening could be walked into, but it was dark inside. It took a few steps into the cave for his eyes to adjust to the darkness. Trying to spot anything, he noticed a sheer drop inside the entrance. Cave floors fell into deep pits. Though he stopped in time, he couldn't see the bottom in the darkness. As he stood up, he saw movement in the cave's back, across the deep crevasse. On instinct, Mr. K raised his rifle to shoot. He was stopped by a huge spear, like a javelin, flying out of the darkness. Impaling his partner, Soldier Dan, sent him flying backward out of the cave entrance. The team witnessed it. A huge humanoid creature bounded out of the cave in seconds. It was 12 feet tall, with fiery red hair and beard. It wore animal skins and had 6 fingers and toes on each hand and foot. It jumped the crevasse and stormed the plateau. The Green Berets fired upon it as it ran out, likely to attack the team. In seconds, a hail of bullets killed the massive creature. What happened was beyond anyone's comprehension, but their training kicked in again. Then they rushed to Dan to treat him after the threat was gone and the caves were empty. Too late. He left. The team faced an impossible situation. They had killed a 12-foot giant, lost a man, and hadn't found the missing unit. Team leader called higher command on radio. He responded with, "You have to come get us. I can't even tell you what just happened, but we have a man down, and we have this combatant. You need to get out here, and you need to take this thing too." 2 helicopters soon followed. One was returning the Green Berets and Dan's body to base. Another helicopter's cargo net was huge. They carried the dead giant in the net, attached it to the helicopter's underside, and flew away. Standard procedure for Mr. K and his team was to return to base and debrief the mission. Your after-action report details what happened. Upon returning, something was different. They received no visitors. Just record what they saw and leave it. So did they. They recorded the giant attack. But higher command told them they couldn't include those details in their report. They were told to alter. They were told, "We can't say you fought a giant in a cave." Change the report. Despite knowing it was a lie, they rewrote the report to say they encountered a normal threat who killed Dan with small arms fire. They had to sign non-disclosure agreements to keep quiet about what they saw in the cave after submitting the false report. After that, they were told to forget. When they tried to find more information, all official reports about that operation were heavily redacted or classified. No one told Mr. K what happened to the missing infantry unit. It was all a black hole mystery. In 2016, 14 years have passed. K decided to reveal the truth. He thought it was wrong to hide what happened and how his friend Dan died. They agreed after talking to his teammates. He told his story because of that. When he did, he found other military personnel had seen the giant. At the airfield where the giant's body was brought, pilots saw a 12 to 15-foot tall creature with 6 fingers and 6 toes loaded onto a transport plane. They were told to never mention it and to remove it from their reports. Everyone who encountered this creature was sworn to secrecy, and the government tried to hide it. The story confuses me. Some part of me wants to trust Mr. K and others. I remember my grounded interpreter in Afghanistan believing something strange was living in those caves. Perhaps possible. You feel like anything could be hidden in those mountains in that ancient alien landscape. With an infantry unit still missing and a Green Beret who was killed in action, his team wants the truth about his death told. Government concealment seems obvious. They may be hiding something, but this story seems to have more to it. Much obliged for watching. Leave a comment on today's episode. We have a whole playlist of true crime episodes to binge from. Next time. Farewell.